Tuesday's terror attack on America has Washington and its allies focused on targeting those who are responsible.
We will go after that group, that network, and those who have harbored, supported, and aided that network to rip the network up.
For many Americans, the focus remains on those who lost their lives and those who are still missing. You're watching CNN's continuing coverage of America Under Attack, the search for answers. I'm Relitza Vasileva at the CNN Center.
And I'm Jonathan Mann. Americans are beginning a national day of remembrance for the victims of the terror attacks. For many, the enormity of the tragedy is still incomprehensible, the scope of the disaster still immeasurable. CNN has obtained remarkable pictures of the aftermath of the attack in Lower Manhattan. This home video is shot from inside the World Financial Center complex, which is next to what remains of the World Trade Center. One observer described the area as the view from hell. Outside Washington, firefighters were back at work at the Pentagon overnight. Authorities say it took about 25 minutes to knock down the new flames that began racing up one side of the gash in the building's walls. Rescuers are still searching for the voice and data recorders of the plane that crashed into the Pentagon Tuesday.
A security crackdown at 2 of New York City's major airports has resulted in at least 8 arrests. All were booked as passengers on flights from Kennedy or LaGuardia airports on Thursday. Law enforcement sources tell CNN the group includes at least 4 people who were seen at one of the airports on the day of the attacks. They say the 4 were taken into custody for carrying fake documentation, including one man who was posing as a pilot. The sources say immigration issues also played a role in their arrests, but they did not elaborate. They say all had booked open-ended tickets with no return date, and that raised a red flag. Kennedy, LaGuardia, and New York airports were all shut down late Thursday as part of a security ground stop. Incoming flights were allowed to land, but takeoffs have been halted. In a separate development, Philippine President Gloria Macapagal Arroyo says the Philippines and the United States have conducted a raid at a hotel in Manila in connection with the terrorist attacks.
There was a joint operation between the Philippine police and U.S. operatives, including Bayview Hotel, which is just in front of the U.S. Embassy, with regard to some suspected links between what happened in the U.S. and some of the connections that might have been in the Philippines.
Back in Washington, members of Congress were told to evacuate the U.S. Capitol late Thursday. A suspicious package was the cause. Lawmakers were allowed back in less than an hour to get on with their business. And just hours after the scare, the White House and Congress agreed on a $40 billion emergency aid package. The amount is twice the White House had originally requested.
Investigators have found the data recorder from United Flight 93. That's the hijacked airliner that crashed in western Pennsylvania Tuesday. The data recorder was discovered in a crater left when the plane slammed into the ground. It has now been sent to the National Transportation Safety Board in Washington for analysis. Authorities say it may provide vital information on that thwarted hijacking. Most U.S. airports resumed operations Thursday under a set of stringent new security measures. By afternoon, more than 1,200 domestic flights were flying above the U.S. Flights from overseas, though, remained banned. There was one exception, however. Airlines that had been diverted to Canada after Tuesday's attacks were allowed to bring their passengers back to U.S. soil.
Horror and shock gripped the U.S. public after Tuesday's attacks, which killed people from around the globe. Now Americans of many faiths will join President Bush today in a national day of prayer and remembrance for the victims. The president plans to visit the site of the destruction in Manhattan after attending a church service in Washington.
The president will attend a church service here at the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C., and the president is asking all Americans at their lunch hours to go and attend a church, a synagogue, a mosque, a place of their own choosing for worship, to say a prayer in assistance to the families and the victims of this horrible incident.
In London, Queen Elizabeth II and Prime Minister Tony Blair will attend a service at St. Paul's Cathedral. A memorial service for the dead is also taking place at St. Mary's Cathedral in Dublin. Prime Minister Bertie Ahern will attend. In Berlin, a vigil will be held at the Brandenburg Gate, and France will observe a moment of silence for the victims. Meanwhile, in New York, inclement weather is slowing rescue operations. However, with more than 4,700 still missing, the work goes on. Garrick Utley joins us live from New York with the latest. Garrick.
Yes, despite the thunderstorm, electrical storms, the lightning strikes, which has interrupted the work, the workers are not disappearing, and it is expected to resume as soon as possible there. As we've been reporting, and as we all know, we're looking now at Lower Manhattan. There you can see the lights at the work site and some of the plume of smoke rising there. As we know, what we're looking at is the financial heart of the world, of the world economy. And indeed, the fact that the stock exchanges down there in the Wall Street area have been closed this week, will not reopen to Monday, has had a profound impact on sort of financial psychology worldwide. And I thought it might be interesting to take a moment to recall how Wall Street and that financial heart of the world economy came to be. It was in the late 1700s that some American entrepreneurs, investors in the young America of that time, late 1700s, wanted a place to get together and buy and sell shares in these young fledgling companies that would grow and make the American economy what it was. But there were no stock exchanges, so where did they meet? Well, they met each day under a buttonwood tree, and there informally they bought and sold shares, little slips of paper. Well, over the years, that grew. Stock exchanges were built. They've had their ups and downs. And in many ways, that whole process culminated at the end of the 20th century, the construction of two 110-story twin towers called the World Trade Center. Stop and think about that for a moment. It took more than 200 years to culminate with those two towers that shadowed over Wall Street, in the heart of the financial capital of the world. It took 1 hour last Tuesday to bring them down. Well, just before that thunderstorm struck this evening, that work site where the towers stood was full of activity. And our Alessio Vinci, who's been monitoring the rescue effort there, offered us this report.
500 yards behind me, the rescue operation is continuing. It is now more than 2 days that the rescue workers are sifting through the debris and trying to find if more people or any people can be found alive underneath there. The workers there is a big security concern for the rescue workers. Earlier today, some of the workers were asked to leave an area around the building, as it appears that this building was shifting. Of course, among the many thousands of people who are still missing, there are still 300 firefighters, 30 police officers, and 30 Port Authority police, and certainly the people there who are trying to sift through the debris, they are first and foremost concerned with their security. One of the buildings was also evacuated. As you can see, there is a lot of activity here. Ambulances going in. There is a long line of trucks going inside and trying to take some of the debris. We understand more than 6,000 tons of debris have been removed so far. The Staten Island, they've been brought to Staten Island. The FBI is going through it. The latest official count is 184 sets of human remains found so far. 47 are entire bodies, and only 35 of them have been identified. The number of missing people, more than 4,700. More than 4,700. Among them, of course, the Americans who are working inside the World Trade Center, but also many foreigners, many people from Germany, from Japan, from Britain. That number again, 4,700, more than 4,700 missing. I'm Alessio Vinci, CNN, reporting from Manhattan.
And throughout Manhattan, of course, as life returns to more or less normality these days, there's always this question about the New York temperament. New Yorkers being seen as being obnoxious, obstreperous, very difficult. Are we a different breed? Well, one reason perhaps that image exists is because people in New York have to live differently than people across the nation. There are no backyards here. There's really no space. People here, 7 million of them, live close to one another. Many of them live in sort of a dormitory living in these high-rising apartment buildings. Maybe that explains some of this different temperament. We thought it'd be interesting to get a different perspective of the New Yorker, not from somebody who lives here, but from an out-of-towner. Our Bruce Burkhardt, who works for CNN and reports for CNN from Atlanta. Here's his report.
As devastating as this was, as unimaginably sad as this was, as much as the worst-case scenario almost looks good compared to this, there's something else that has emerged from the rubble.
Something that is oddly reassuring to a non-New Yorker like myself who's ventured into this city at such a time. Something that proves New York is much more than its distinctive, though now altered, skyline.
Pissed off.
It is an attitude, best described as Well, yeah, that kind of describes it, but not completely. It is not a place that likes to show off its soft underbelly.
We hurt, we have pain, and we bleed. We tend to be able to handle adversity better than the average person in the rest of the country.
Are you surprised by New Yorkers and how they deal with this thing?
No, I don't think so, because they've always done this.
And in America, where the physical landscape has changed dramatically in the last 50 years with its strip malls and developments, walking in New York is like strolling through a 1950s black and white movie.
Even now, an enduring sameness, the skyscrapers, the hustle bustle, the sea of yellow cabs, and that why I oughta pound you attitude.
I hope we strike back, and I hope we strike back hard.
But despite the tough words and a superficial return to normality, people lining up for Broadway tickets, friends meeting for coffee just blocks from Ground Zero, despite all this, normality is still a long way off.
I think the anger is going to come. But right now, everybody you speak to is just sad.
Sadness, almost debilitating sadness, but with it, something uniquely New York, a certain defiance.
Tell Andy and Betty in Indiana, Jen and Joey are fine.
We will. Bruce Burkhardt, CNN, New York.
Of course, the old saying is that New York is a great place to visit, but I never would want to live there. And yet, look at the figures. Others have different views because, according to the most recent census of the United States and the city of New York, the population in this town has actually gone up. Relitza?
Garrick, thank you. John?
There is defiance in New York, and we've just seen it, but there's also sorrow, the wrenching uncertainty of what's happened to so many people. It's brought hundreds of others onto the streets of New York, clutching photos of the missing. Relatives and friends say they're also trying to hang on to hope.
Sadie called at about 5 minutes after 9. She said, "Oh God, please save me." She said she's trapped on the 106th floor. She was screaming that she can't get out. She's trapped, she can't get out. So she was yelling. She said, "Now, I don't know what to do. I'm coughing. The heat is coming. Please, I'm coming. I need water, I need water." And the phone dropped.
We've been hearing lots of good stories about people making it off of really high floors, so we just know that she's one of them, and we just have to figure out where she is.
The first phone call that he made to her was that they are evacuating, and we were all very happy because we were all kind of on the phone, my whole family and my sister. We were all like, "Oh my God, what happened?" Because I work downtown. And then they said they were evacuating. We were all happy. "Go, go, go," said my sister, "go." And then he called again and said, "Oh, you know what, everything's fine, don't worry." He was trying to calm her down. "Stay calm, I love you so much, don't worry about me, I'll be okay." And then they hung up, and then as soon as about 50 seconds later, the other airplane hit. We saw it on the news.
Well, it's really frustrating because you just want to go in there and start tearing things out, ripping them sheet metal. The sheet metal workers are doing it, the steel workers are in there, the pipe fitters, everybody, engineers, Con Ed, I mean, just everybody. And it's frustrating because you have to stop. You hear whistles, signals for you to stop because they think they hear a sound, a movement. They'll stop. I mean, total silence. And, and then it might be false alarm, or if it is, you have to, people are so buried down there, you have no idea.
Our website, CNN.com, is launching an effort to help locate people who are missing in New York. If you have a picture of a missing friend or relative, go to our website and follow the instructions there. Send us the picture along with a contact number.
There's been tough talk from U.S. Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld. He describes Tuesday's attack as an assault on the American way of life. The Defense Secretary has warned that protecting the country from terrorists will require, quote, a war and a sustained effort. While U.S. Secretary of State Colin Powell has named the Saudi-born Osama bin Laden as a prime suspect, Rumsfeld has been more circumspect on that score, but he warns that any action the U.S. takes against any perpetrators would be justified.
I don't think of it as retaliation. I don't think of it as punishment. I think of it as self-defense. The United States of America has every right to defend itself. And that is what it is about. It is consciously saying that countries and entities and people who actively oppose the United States and damage our interests by acts of violence, acts of war, are our enemies. And they are people and organizations and entities and states that we have every right to defend ourselves against.
Pakistan is asking the United States for time to consider a list of U.S. demands. The United States says it needs Pakistan to help find those responsible for the terrorist attacks. Our State Department correspondent Andrea Koppel has details.
Tightening the diplomatic screws on Pakistan's president, the Bush administration presented a list of specific steps it says Pakistan must take. Among them, to share information on what it knows about Tuesday's attacks and Osama bin Laden's terrorist network, to close the border between Pakistan and Afghanistan and cut off fuel shipments, and eventually to provide the United States with use of Pakistani airspace if needed.
We haven't yet publicly identified the organization we believe was responsible. But when you look at the list of candidates, one resides in that region.
Later, when pressed by reporters,
when you spoke of a candidate who resides in that region, were you speaking of Osama bin Laden?
Yes.
For the first time, Powell saying publicly what many have said privately, that bin Laden's network, based in Afghanistan, is a prime suspect. And as Afghanistan's neighbor and longtime supporter, Pakistan could play a critical role in finding bin Laden and shutting down his terrorist training camps for good. Following another full day of intense meetings and conversations between U.S. and Pakistani officials, President Musharraf assured the Bush administration of Pakistan's unstinted cooperation in the fight against terrorism. He said Pakistan is ready to commit all of its resources to locate and punish those responsible for the attacks in New York and Washington.
President Musharraf is in a difficult position. He has aided the Taliban for a number of years. But also he needs the United States very badly right now. We are improving our relations with India. He can't afford, I think, to antagonize the United States.
State Department officials say early indications from Pakistan are, quote, very positive. Still, Secretary Powell acknowledged with economic sanctions in place, the U.S. has very little leverage to turn up the heat. But he says the U.S. could make life a lot easier in Pakistan if its government cooperates. Andrea Koppel, CNN, at the State Department.
And Tom Mantier joins us now live from Islamabad. Tom, what has been the domestic reaction in Pakistan to President Musharraf's support for the U.S.?
Ralitza, we may be able to judge that in about 10 minutes. At 3 mosques across Islamabad, there are going to be prayers said for the American victims of this tragedy. So the public will have their chance to speak out. But as Andrea was saying in her piece, it is a very difficult situation that the Pakistani president finds himself in, because there are going to be domestic ramifications if indeed Pakistan cooperates with the United States in any type of military action in Afghanistan. The streets may be set alight here with protesters. And you have to look at where the Pakistani president comes from. He comes from the military side, not the political side, so he doesn't have any real political support as a politician might have, because he's really gone out to clean up politics in Pakistan, so he really can't count on them. There are divisions within the military as far as support for the Taliban is concerned, so he's really in a very tight spot. But when you look at the economy of Pakistan, which is in a shambles right now, with Musharraf also going to the World Bank and others trying to seek loans to improve the economic situation here, that could be in jeopardy if he goes against the United States and swims upstream on this. So there is subtle pressure that is coming in the front door and not so subtle pressure to cooperate with the U.S. in its efforts to gather intelligence on Osama bin Laden and provide even access to the airspace if there was indeed a military strike against targets in Afghanistan. So he's really in a tough spot here politically and militarily. So he's really walking a very fine line. He has said unstinted support. What everyone is waiting to see is if push comes to shove, what unstinted really means. Ralitza?
And Tom, what about pressures from religious groups?
It is those religious groups that really make up the big problem domestically that he's going to have. If there are people out in the streets, as they were the last time there was an attack against Afghanistan, making demonstrations and burning flags, if this was a long, sustained campaign, air campaign against Afghanistan, there would be a long campaign of terror on the streets of places like Islamabad and Karachi and Lahore and elsewhere in Pakistan. So there is a real domestic problem for the government here if they side with the United States. If they don't side with the United States, the problems, though, may be even bigger.
Tom, thank you.
Whatever the stakes in Pakistan or elsewhere, for many Americans, the shock from Tuesday's attacks has given way to anger and cries for revenge, many directed against Osama bin Laden. U.S. officials say more than one terrorist group may have been involved in the attacks, though, and as CNN's David Ensor reports, getting at bin Laden may prove to be a very difficult task.
The nation is angry about thousands of innocent deaths. U.S. officials say the evidence so far points to Osama bin Laden's group, and the Bush administration is talking tough.
We will go after that group, that network, and those who have harbored, supported, and aided that network to rip the network up. And when we're through with that network, we will continue with a global assault against terrorism in general.
But if it is bin Laden, how to get at him and his top lieutenants? Some argue for giving Afghanistan's Taliban government an ultimatum. Turn him over or else.
We know where your ministries are. We know where your houses are. We're simply going to obliterate them from the face of the planet.
Bouncing that rubble with a lot of B-52 loads of bombs, I don't think is going to change Afghanistan all that much.
No, say most analysts in and out of government. If you want to roll up bin Laden and al-Qaeda, it is going to take more than bombs. It will take ground troops.
In order for us to preserve America and our way of life, we're going to have to sacrifice American treasure and, unfortunately, in some cases, perhaps some American blood.
It is not just a question of grabbing or killing one man or even 20. There are a dozen or more training camps, U.S. intelligence says, producing more terrorists dedicated to killing Americans.
Revenge alone is not an answer. There has to be a complete eradication and elimination of all the training camps.
And much of bin Laden's base of support is in neighboring Pakistan, through which money from around the Arab world is funneled to the al-Qaeda coffers. It is a treacherous and dangerous area indeed.
If you start moving in ground troops and you're willing to occupy countries for long periods of time, you do change things rather significantly for terrorists. I'm not sure this country is ready to do that, even if it does have a fit of passion right now, and it may or may not make sense for the U.S. to do that in its larger interests.
Bottom line, U.S. forces might be able to get bin Laden, but that alone would not stop the terror. Administration officials saying they will do nothing precipitous, knowing this one is going to be very, very difficult. David Ensor, CNN, Washington.
Who to punish and how? We're joined now from London by Fred Halliday, a professor of international relations at the London School of Economics and a specialist on the region. Thanks so much for talking with us. The talk here is Osama bin Laden and Afghanistan. Does it make sense to punish Afghanistan if indeed he is the man behind these attacks?
It certainly makes sense to punish those who have trained and supported Osama bin Laden's organization over many years. We don't know the full details of the training that went into this mission, but if, as it appears, the pilots who carried out the suicide missions in Washington, New York, were actually trained on, albeit old, but nevertheless jets, passenger jets that were left behind in Afghanistan, that would be very significant. But overall, he cannot operate in Afghanistan without the say-so of the Taliban government. And for all that they'll say, oh, he's just a guest, or things in Afghanistan are very fragmented, they have responsibility, not just under international law, but in practice. You and I couldn't go there and set up an organization. We'd be dead in 2 minutes. So it is quite an effective system of rule, and they are responsible. The problem about punishing Afghanistan as a country is it's taken more punishment than any other country in the world in the last 20 years. Economically, in terms of refugees, it is a devastated country. And that, of course, is something that has to be balanced against the desire to punish those who supported bin Laden. But I have to add, the Taliban themselves have a patron, and the patron is Pakistan. In effect, that is a client government of Pakistan. They provide many of its security and military personnel. They set them up in business. They may not be responsible for everything the Taliban do, but the trail of responsibility has to go to Pakistan as well as to Afghanistan. What that means for U.S. diplomacy is for others to say.
Let me ask you, to your mind, what is going through the minds of the leadership of the Taliban right now? Do they want to tough this one out? Do they want to make a deal? What do you think they're saying in Kandahar and Kabul right now?
Well, remember that the Sudanese government supported some terrorist actions on a much lower level years ago, and then in the end they did a kind of a split. They let one group go, Osama bin Laden, go and sent him to Afghanistan, and they handed over another one, Carlos the Jackal, from the Sudan. Now, the Taliban, I think, are thinking also, they don't want to go down the tube entirely, but they support military actions against neighboring states, including, I would stress, Iran, who they detest. They've supported military actions in Central Asia, and they support this more militant view of Islamic fundamentalism as being something which is at war with the West. It's clear in their rhetoric, it's true in their actions. Secondly, they must have helped prepare this operation. And if it goes well for them, and if it goes well for Osama bin Laden, the consequence will be very simple but very important. It's a recruiting measure, a very gruesome, cruel, but calculated recruiting measure. They're not going to defeat the United States. They don't think for a minute that they can do that. It's not like Vietnam fighting the US in the 70s. They are carrying out these actions. They're what the anarchists call propaganda of the deed, to punish the enemy, but also to recruit. On a smaller scale, that was the purpose behind the destruction of the Buddhist statues last March. It was to say to radical Muslims, we're standing up to these people, we're not going to take any notice. However, if the cost looks like it's going to be too high, they could do anything, and they could indeed even surrender bin Laden or say he'd had a car accident.
How, in theory, would the United States, how would the West make Afghanistan pay if Afghanistan's already fought itself into rubble through long years of civil war, if the government is insensitive to the poverty and suffering its people already feel? What can be done?
Well, I think there are two things that can be done, and I know that every politician and diplomat in the world is thinking of this. I'm not saying anything original. On the one hand, those in the Taliban leadership and in the associated special services of Pakistan who were associated with this, as well as Osama bin Laden, can be attacked, can be arrested, can be dealt with in whatever way is possible. I'm not sure whether the United States wants to bring them back in a Noriega-like way and put them in a Florida jail, or whether they would be happy to have a bloody battle there. But it's to destroy the leadership who were responsible in the Qaeda organization of bin Laden, in the Taliban, and in Pakistan for this. That's number one. It has to be counterbalanced by political limits for the population of Afghanistan, for whom we have a responsibility anyway, since the West helped create the mess there, in fact, largely helped create the mess there in recent years. But secondly, there have to be countervailing measures to show that this is not a war with the third world or the Islamic world. And I would say that there has to be more diplomatic activity to address the other issues that have fueled this. That goes from Kashmir in the east through to the Gulf problems, through to the Palestine question. In other words, there has to be not just military containment of what's done, but countervailing long-term diplomatic activity.
Professor Halliday, I'm going to jump in because you're making a crucial point here. U.S. officials have been making it known, in fact, that their war on terrorism is not just a war against Osama bin Laden. The U.S. Secretary of State Colin Powell had this to say just a short time ago.
With the severity of this tragedy in Washington and New York against America, we now have to use this tragedy and respond to those and take care of those who are responsible for it But at the same time, we should see this in a broader sense, that this is a horrible blight on the civilized world. And so we will also be focusing on other organizations, terrorist organizations, who go after us, our citizens, our interests, and allies.
Other organizations that go against us and our citizens and our allies. Read between the lines for us. How many different groups does the Secretary of State, does the United States want to take on now?
Well, in one sense, Secretary of State Powell and also President Bush himself have set themselves an impossible task. There will not be, in the Middle East or anywhere else, in Ireland or in Colombia or in Sri Lanka or 20 other places we could mention, there will not be an end to irregular forms of violence in the foreseeable future. Terrorism, in that sense, cannot be defeated or eradicated. Terrorism can be contained. And secondly, some of the causes of it can be addressed. But you've seen, even in a relatively contained situation like Ireland, where you've got a few thousand deaths over 20 years, it's been very, very difficult to eradicate the issue entirely. But you can contain it. But that there may be other organizations close to Al-Qaeda, yes. Then we have the other problem, which is every use of violence by a people or a group who claim oppression or who are oppressed violence, is it terrorism? That's a much more difficult issue. And I think, for example, I don't think most people in the U.S. would regard people fighting for the independence of Tibet as terrorists, but some would. I think there is a big issue about abuse of the issue of terrorism in the Arab-Israeli context. I think the Palestinians are entitled to their own state. I don't think they're entitled to go up blowing up people in supermarkets. So a line will have to be drawn. But this is not just a judgment matter. In this sense, Ronald Reagan was wrong when he said one person's freedom fighter is another person's terrorist. There are international conventions, there are Geneva protocols, there are moral principles about where terrorism ends and legitimate use of violence begins. And I think that the U.S. will have to take note of that. But chasing over everybody with a Kalashnikov or a homemade pipe bomb in the world is a very foolish thing. And in that sense, I fear they've put the goal much too high, as well as, of course, not making clear where they think terrorism ends and other forms of violence begin.
On that note, Fred Halliday of the London School of Economics, thank you so much for talking with us. Lolita.
John, we have this new development in the investigation into the attacks. The FBI in New York has confirmed that they're actively searching in the area of the Thunderbird Motel in Seaside Heights, New Jersey. Though authorities would not release any details about the nature of the search other than describe it as, quote, pursuing one of the many leads into the potential hijackers or those who may have assisted them. We'll bring you more details on that as soon as they become available. Not just terrorism, leader after American leader has referred to Tuesday's atrocities as an act of war. And for now, at least, the country seems ready to adopt the saying, "We make war that we may live in peace." Bruce Morton explains.
World War II brought Americans together. Most believed that Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan were evil and aggressive. Americans demanded victory. The phrase of the day was unconditional surrender. Korea and Vietnam, in contrast, divided the country. Vietnam, in particular, left Americans suspicious, leery of wars, and in the conflict since, the motto seems to have been, bomb all you want, but we can't stand American casualties. That seems different now. No yellow ribbons, bring the hostages home, please. Flags this time, half-staff but proud. People are lining up to give blood. The Red Cross 800 number logged 700,000 calls in the first 6 hours after an appeal went out. Some military recruitment officers see an increased interest, and the country seems prepared to send its young people into harm's way.
I think the United States is in a long twilight struggle against these forces of evil that have chosen to destroy us because we are good. And I believe that it may take a lot of time, a lot of American treasure, and perhaps some American blood.
Make no mistake about it, my resolve is steady and strong about winning this war that has been declared on America.
A goal of victory, not compromise. And later, wars change countries. World War II made the United States a world power committed to an international role. Isolationism left behind. Vietnam left the United States more cynical. Americans had learned their government could lie to them. This time, unity so far, agreement on a goal so far. Will that change if the struggle is long? We can't know. The fight is just beginning. Bruce Morton, CNN, Washington.
Updating the latest developments now, word of a pre-dawn raid extending the investigation into the twin attacks on the World Trade Center. The FBI is said now to be searching an area around the Thunderbird Hotel in Seaside Heights, New Jersey. No word on what they're looking for there. The FBI describes it simply as pursuing one of many leads into the potential hijackers. So once again, a pre-dawn raid on the Thunderbird Hotel, an FBI investigation that is still unexplained. A joint U.S.-Philippines raid on a hotel in Manila has resulted in the arrest of 3 people identified as Omanis. Rescuers in New York City are working through rain and lightning as efforts to find survivors continue. It's been almost 3 days since the attacks now. And around 4,700 people are still believed to be missing from the destruction of the World Trade Center. Another 190 people are unaccounted for from the attack on the Pentagon. Meanwhile, the White House and Congress have agreed on a $40 billion emergency aid package for New York and Virginia. The amount of the recovery package is twice the sum originally requested by the White House. And tensions remain high in New York. Police received more than 90 false bomb threats by noon Thursday. In yet another development, authorities have arrested at least 8 people at the city's 2 major airports, one carrying a fake pilot's license. Authorities say that 4 of those arrested were seen at one of the airports the day of the attacks. Law enforcement sources tell CNN the 4 fled that day as they were challenged at the ticket counter. From the United States to Germany to the Philippines, a manhunt is very clearly underway. In the U.S. alone, more than 4,000 FBI agents are working to track down those responsible for Tuesday's attacks. Mike Betcher has more now on the ongoing investigation.
As airports opened across the country, police were watching closely. A total of 8 people were arrested at 2 of New York's airports. At New York's Kennedy Airport, one man who was carrying a fake pilot ID was arrested. 4 or 5 other people trying to check in for flights at Kennedy were detained for questioning, either because they were carrying false documents or were in the country illegally. At New York's LaGuardia Airport, police detained at least 2 other men for questioning. After the spate of arrests and detentions, all New York area airports were closed again. A few other airports in the U.S. have also shut down once more because of security concerns. Attorney General John Ashcroft said FBI agents are making progress in their investigation, adding that they have identified the hijackers aboard all 4 ill-fated jets.
The total number of hijackers, to our best estimate and our best knowledge, given the information at this time, on the 4 planes that crashed was at least 18. Unless contradicted by evidence which we wouldn't anticipate. 2 planes had 5 hijackers and 2 other planes had 4 hijackers each.
Mohammed Atta, shown in this photograph, and Marwan al-Shari are 2 of the men on that list of 18, according to federal investigative sources. Both held United Arab Emirate passports, but it's not clear if they are actually citizens of that country. The lives the 2 men led are the objects of an intensive international investigation, stretching from Florida to Germany. In Hamburg, Germany, federal police launched an extensive search of an apartment shared by Mohammed Atta and Marwan al-Shari last February. During an additional search of another Hamburg apartment, a woman was taken away for questioning. She clutched a baby in her arms as German police tried to hide her with a sheet. During the night, a total of 8 apartments were searched in the Hamburg area. Back in the U.S. in Pompano Beach, Florida, FBI agents converged on a small rental car company called Warrix. Records show that Atta rented 2 automobiles at that location.
Well, the first contract, he only put on 200 miles, 254 miles or something like that, which is very small. That's exceptionally small. The next contract was the 2-week rental, and he drove 1,915 miles, which he had told me he'd been over on the West Coast. He called me from over on the West Coast.
4,000 FBI agents spread across the country knocked on hundreds of doors trying to track down others who were involved in the conspiracy. Before the job is finished, they will have knocked on tens of thousands more. Mike Betcher, CNN, Atlanta.
Sharing the nation's grief, the organizers of most major sporting events have postponed or canceled games and competitions. The National Football League said games set for Sunday will not be played. Major League Baseball put off the resumption of its season until Monday. Most college football games scheduled for the weekend have also been canceled. The Ladies Pro Golf Association also canceled its weekend tournament. NASCAR postponed Sunday's race in New Hampshire until November, and the National Hockey League canceled its preseason games.
U.S. financial markets are closed on this day, but Europe is trading. And for an update now on world markets, we join Richard Quest in London. Richard?
Jonathan, many thanks indeed. Yes, both Asia and European investors continue to hold their nerve this Friday, despite the uncertainty over how Wall Street will react. That happens on Monday at 9:30 Eastern. Let's get an update on what's happening in European markets. Liz George is at the London Stock Exchange. Liz.
Richard, thanks. We are holding our nerve down here on the European markets in London, in the City of London as well. We've seen a little bit of wavering around going on in and out of negative territory, and it's extremely light trade. So really people are saying that there's prices all over the place. People don't really know where to set these prices. They're very, very uncertain. But however, they're trying their best really to retain calm within the markets. I will show you the figures at the moment. We're essentially flat on London's FTSE. Germany's DAX is up around 0.2% at the moment, and in Paris the CAC 40 is up 0.47. It's the technology stocks in Paris which are helping a little bit there, and in Germany it's the large insurance companies and the reinsurers which are actually helping to support that market a little bit there. But the note of caution really is that it's very, very light trade. These figures don't really mean anything at the moment. Everybody's waiting to find out what's going to happen when the US markets reopen. However, there is a feeling that the fighting spirit really will return when those US markets do open, and that the effort will be to keep calm in the market, to do everything that's possible to prevent things like shorting the market and driving it down, and really to keep calm across all of these European bourses and help the US markets to retain calm as well. Richard.
Yes, George, many thanks indeed. Meanwhile, Asian investors are reacting differently to events. Tokyo Nikkei jumped 4%, taking comfort from stability. We're now going to join the British Prime Minister, Tony Blair, in Parliament.
Some sectors, like the airlines and insurance industry, will be badly affected. But financial markets have quickly stabilised. The oil producers have helped keep the oil price steady. And businesses proceed as far as possible as normal. So there are three things which we must now take forward urgently. First, we must bring to justice those responsible. Rightly, President Bush and the United States government have proceeded with care. They did not lash out. They did not strike first and think afterwards. Their very deliberation is a measure of the seriousness of their intent. They, together with allies, will want to identify with care those responsible. This is a judgment that must and will be based on hard evidence. Once that judgment is made, the appropriate action can be taken. It will be determined, it will take time, it will continue over time, until this menace is properly dealt with and its machinery of terror destroyed. But one thing should be very clear. By their acts, these terrorists and those behind them have made themselves the enemies of the entire civilized world. Their objective, we know. Our objective will be to bring to account those who have organized, aided, abetted and incited this act of infamy. And those that harbor or help them have a choice, either to cease their protection of our enemies or be treated as an enemy themselves. Secondly, this is a moment when every difference between nations, every divergence of interest, every irritant in our relations should be put to one side in one common endeavour. The world should stand together against this outrage. NATO has already, for the first time since it was founded in 1949, invoked Article 5 and determined that this attack in America will be considered as an attack against the alliance as a whole. The UN Security Council on Wednesday passed a resolution which set out its readiness to take all necessary steps to combat terrorism. From Russia, China, the European Union, from Arab states, from Asia and the Americas, from every continent of the world has come united condemnation. This solidarity must be maintained and then translated into support for action. Mr. Speaker, we do not yet know the exact origin of this evil. But if, as appears likely, it is so-called Islamic fundamentalists, we know that they do not speak or act for the vast majority of decent, law-abiding Muslims throughout this world. I say to our Arab and Muslim friends, neither you nor Islam is responsible for this. On the contrary, we know you share our shock at this terrorism, and we ask you as friends to make common cause with us in defeating this barbarism that is totally foreign to the true spirit and teachings of Islam. And I would add that now more than ever, we have reason not to let the Middle East peace process slip still further, but if at all possible, to reinvigorate it and move it forward. Thirdly, whatever the nature of the immediate response to these terrible events in America, we need to rethink dramatically the scale and nature of the action the world takes to combat terrorism. We know a good deal about many of these terror groups, but as a world we have not been effective at dealing with them. And of course it is difficult. We are democratic, they are not. We have respect for human life, they do not. We hold essentially liberal values, they do not. As we look into these issues, it is important that we never lose sight of our basic values. But we have to understand the nature of this enemy and act accordingly. Civil liberties are a vital part of our country and of our democratic world. But the most basic liberty of all is the right of the ordinary citizen to go about their business free from fear or terror. That liberty has been denied in the cruelest way imaginable to the passengers aboard the hijacked planes, to those who perished in the trade towers and the Pentagon, to the hundreds of rescue workers killed as they tried to help. So we need to look once more, nationally and internationally, at extradition laws and the mechanisms for international justice, at how these terrorist groups are financed and their money laundered, and the links between terror and crime, and we need to frame a response that will work and will hold internationally. For this form of terror knows no mercy, no pity, and it knows no boundaries. And let us make this reflection too. A week ago, anyone suggesting that terrorists would kill thousands of innocent people in downtown New York would have been dismissed as alarmist. Yet it happened. We know that these groups are fanatics capable of killing without discrimination. The limits on the numbers that they kill and their methods of killing are not governed by any sense of morality. The limits are only practical and technical. We know that they would, if they could, go further and use chemical, biological, or even nuclear weapons of mass destruction. We know also that there are groups or people, occasionally states, who will trade the technology and capability of such weapons. It is time this trade was exposed, disrupted, and stamped out. We have been warned by the events of the 11th of September, and we should act on this warning. So there is a great deal to do, many details to be filled in, much careful work to be undertaken over the coming days and weeks and months. We need to mourn the dead and then act to protect the living. Terrorism has taken on a new and frightening aspect. The people perpetrating it wear the ultimate badge of the fanatic. They are prepared to commit suicide, to die in pursuit of their beliefs. Our beliefs are the very opposite of those of the fanatics. We believe in reason, democracy, and tolerance. And these beliefs are the foundation of our civilized world. They are enduring, they have served us well, and as history has shown, we have been prepared to fight when necessary to defend them. The fanatics should know that we hold our beliefs every bit as strongly as they hold theirs. And now is the time to show it.
Ian Duncan Smith. Mr. Speaker, may I start by thanking you for the opportunity to...
The British Prime Minister, Tony Blair, addressing a recall of Parliament, an indication of the seriousness of the event. It's only the 18th time that Parliament has been recalled since 1948. To assess what Mr. Blair said, I'm joined by CNN's European political editor. He's Robin Oakley. Robin, terrorists have made themselves the enemies of the civilized world.
Yes, we've had the theme already from Mr. Blair. This is an attack not just on the United States, but on democratic values worldwide. Key phrase, I think, when he said, "We stand by our friends." And quite clearly, whatever reservations there may be in any other quarters, in NATO or elsewhere, there will be full military support from Britain for United States action. Interesting that Mr. Blair commended the United States for not striking back immediately without thinking, and he talked about a long slog ahead, a period of care, finding out exactly who was responsible and exactly the right way of hitting back at them.
But hitting back at them, clearly the Prime Minister standing full square with the US President. Mr. Blair saying we must expose, disrupt and stamp out the terrorism. That's military action.
Indeed, it is military action, and I think, again, an important part of what Mr. Blair had to say was that the countries who harbour the terrorists now have a choice. They can either be treated as the enemies of the civilized world and continue to harbour, or they can come aboard. But clearly there is an intention on behalf of the United States and of Britain to hit back at countries who harbour terrorists as well as the terrorists themselves.
The British Foreign Secretary Jack Straw said yesterday that we know up to 100 British citizens have lost their lives, along with those of other nations, and it could be in the middle hundreds. This is clearly more than just a US incident in that sense.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there are countries all over the world now counting their dead in the Twin Towers in the United States. And across Europe, we're hearing more and more noise of casualties. In Britain, ministers are saying privately it could be a total of up to 500. But just one other note I think we need to introduce here. Mr. Blair was very careful to say, although he pointed the finger at Islamic fundamentalists, the Muslim community as a whole, he said, must not be blamed. I think there are strong worries among the politicians of a backlash against Muslim communities everywhere.
Robin Oakley, many thanks indeed. The British Prime Minister, Tony Blair, you see there with Ian Duncan Smith, the new leader of the opposition, talking to the British Parliament, and a recall, the first time it's been recalled back in the summer recess. It's the only 18th time it's happened since 1948. Now back to CNN Center in Atlanta.
Richard, thank you. Former U.S. President Bill Clinton, along with his daughter Chelsea, toured the wreckage of the World Trade Center on Thursday. Chelsea Clinton was only 12 blocks away when the towers collapsed Tuesday. Clinton says President Bush should receive the full support of the American people.
I have two children in the military. He's their dad. He was in on the first and 12th floor, first thing the other morning. His boys down in California, and we need to know where he is.
Was this touched personally?
They're still fighting people. Don't lose hope.
Thank you very much.
We need to support the president and the national government without regard to party, without regard to anything. What we need to do is just to, they'll do the right thing.
A hard rain has been beating down on the twisted wreckage of Lower Manhattan. The poor weather is slowing the work of rescue workers who have been toiling into the early morning hours. Garrick Utley joins us once again from New York City with more. Garrick.
Yes, Relitza, and we're going to talk not so much about that rescue worker, the workers are still there at the scene, but another example, another test of how difficult it is for people in New York to adjust as life begins to return to normal. Case in point, Broadway. The theaters went dark. They were closed for 2 nights because of the tragedy. On Thursday night, they reopened. The lights were there. The bands were playing. The curtain went up. And the big hit on Broadway is The Producers. A big hit. Each seat ticket costs about $100. You can't get a ticket until the end of 2002. People would sell their soul, perhaps sacrifice their firstborn to get in. You just can't do it. Forget it. If you're not familiar with The Producers, suffice it to say it's a Mel Brooks musical comedy with the emphasis on comedy, which involves Adolf Hitler. I'll not go into any details, but it does work as a hit. Anyway, tonight the curtain went up, the first time after the tragedy. There were 100 cancellations. 100 people felt, for as long as I've waited for this great opportunity this night in the theater, I couldn't really bring myself to face it. The sign of our times these days in New York City. And Lauren Sidney reports on the theater today.
For the first time in Broadway history, other than during labor disputes, the show people were silenced for 3 performances in a row. But on Thursday, when regular performances resumed, the old adage, the show must go on, rang true.
It's going to be a little weird. I don't know what to expect, and I don't know whether anybody will come.
But they did come, with mixed emotions.
I feel bad. I just feel that there's 8,000 people buried 2 miles away, and I'm here at a show that's going to be laughing. I'm sorry.
I can't sit and watch it anymore. I can't listen to the names being called out, and it breaks my heart, and I know it breaks everybody's heart.
I waited a long time, you know. I got the tickets a long time ago, and I don't think it does anybody any good if I don't go.
Before the curtain went up, all 23 Broadway houses respectfully dimmed their lights. When the lights went back on at the hit show The Producers, the audience was met by the show's producer.
Each and every one of you has said tonight by coming here, I'm not afraid. Right.
Nor were the show's stars, Nathan Lane and Matthew Broderick.
We all have to try, because otherwise, in a sense, they win, and they are robbing us of our lives, and they've already taken too much.
No, I love it here. You know, I love this city, and it's part of what makes me sad is that these bastards attack this city.
Broadway, like the rest of the nation, is beginning its healing process.
That great song by New York's Irving Berlin, well, it says it all, doesn't it? Jonathan and Relitza.
Garrick, thank you. I'm Relitza Vasilova. Coming up, more of our coverage of America Under Attack, the search for answers.
And on this National Day of Remembrance in the United States, we leave you with some images of the disaster and its aftermath. I'm Jonathan Mann.